In the pre-dawn hours of January 3rd, 2025, as Venezuela awakened to streets emptied by fear and anticipation, a particular pattern of human consciousness completed yet another cycle in its eternal rotation. The strongman who had held power through manipulation, violence, and the systematic destruction of democratic institutions faced the inevitable reckoning that awaits all who mistake domination for sovereignty. But this spectacle of political collapse, broadcast across global media feeds and dissected in endless commentary, conceals within its obvious narrative something far more unsettling and infinitely more personal. For the tyrant who falls in the plaza dwells also in the unmapped territories of your own psyche, and his defeat in the exterior world signals nothing about his status in the interior kingdom where your authentic sovereignty remains perpetually contested. The alchemists of medieval Europe, working in their sealed laboratories with substances both material and metaphysical, understood something about power that our age of psychological literacy has managed to forget, even as it endlessly discusses it. They recognized that the process of transforming base metal into gold, the great work or magnum opus, required first the confrontation with what they termed the Rex or king, a figure of tyrannical solar consciousness that must be ritually killed before any genuine transformation could occur. This was not metaphor in the diminished sense we employ that term today, but rather a precise phenomenological map of the psychic operation required to move from unconscious identification with power to conscious relationship with authentic authority. The king in the alchemical vessel represented the ego structure in its most inflated and defended state, convinced of its own permanence and rightness, demanding absolute submission from all that it surveys. His necessary death, what the texts call the mortificatio regis, marks the beginning of the descent into nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the dissolution of all that seemed solid and certain. Carl Jung, excavating the psychological gold buried in these obscure medieval texts, identified what he termed the shadow archetype, that portion of the psyche containing everything we have refused to acknowledge about ourselves, all the traits and tendencies we have exiled from consciousness because they conflict with our preferred self-image. But within the broader category of shadow material exists a particular formation that Jung recognized as especially potent and especially dangerous, the archetype of the tyrant, the interior despot who rules through fear, demands absolute obedience, and recognizes no law beyond his own appetite for control. This figure appears in dreams as the cruel king, the ruthless dictator, the authoritarian father, the merciless judge. He manifests in waking life as the voice that permits no deviation from rigid standards, that crushes spontaneity, that transforms every relationship into a hierarchy of dominance and submission. Unlike other shadow formations that might be integrated through gradual awareness and acceptance, the tyrant archetype presents a unique challenge. It must be confronted, dethroned, and ritually killed before the work of integration can properly begin. The philosophical architecture underlying this necessity reveals itself when we understand that the tyrant represents not merely excessive control, but rather a specific distortion of the principle of order itself. In the Hermetic cosmology that informed alchemical practice, the universe unfolds through the dynamic interplay of complementary principles: active and passive, masculine and feminine, solve and coagula, dissolution and coagulation. Healthy order emerges from the marriage of these opposites, from their mutual respect and reciprocal influence. The tyrant archetype arises when one principle, typically the solar, masculine, active, ordering principle, refuses its partnership with the lunar, feminine, receptive, chaotic principle and attempts instead to rule alone. This is the psychological equivalent of what the alchemists called the untempered sulfur, the burning principle separated from its moistening mercury, the fire without water to contain and channel it. The result is not true order, but rather a brittle, paranoid, ultimately sterile rigidity that must constantly intensify its violence to maintain its grip on a reality that perpetually threatens to reveal its fundamental illegitimacy. When Nicolas Maduro appeared on state television, surrounded by military officers whose loyalty had been purchased with control over criminal enterprises, declaring his continued authority over a population that had clearly rejected him in whatever remained of electoral process, he enacted in the political theatre what countless individuals enact in the psychological theatre every day. The refusal to relinquish control when control has clearly failed, the intensification of force when persuasion has collapsed, the appeal to conspiracy, to external enemies, to the permanent emergency that justifies permanent exception. This is the tyrant archetype, in its final, most desperate phase, when it can no longer credibly claim to serve the good of the whole, and must instead rely on naked coercion and the systematic destruction of shared reality itself. In your own psyche, this corresponds to those moments when your inner authoritarian, sensing that its rule is threatened by emerging awareness or changing circumstances, tightens its grip and escalates its demands, rather than allowing space for the new that is trying to be born. The tyrant always justifies himself through the invocation of necessity and the fabrication of emergency. Maduro claimed to be defending the revolution, protecting the people from imperialism, preserving national sovereignty against foreign interference. Your interior tyrant employs parallel rhetoric. I must maintain these rigid standards to protect you from laziness, from mediocrity, from the judgment of others. I must control every variable to prevent catastrophe. I must never relax my vigilance or chaos will overwhelm you. The alchemists recognized this voice as what they termed the false king or rex non-legitimus, the usurper who claims royal authority but possesses no genuine connection to the self, that deeper organizing center of the psyche that Jung identified as the true sovereign of the interior kingdom. The false king rules through identification with persona, with social role, with achievement, with the accumulation of external markers of status and power. He cannot tolerate any challenge to his authority, because his authority rests not on authentic being, but on a performance of power that must be continuously maintained through acts of domination. The alchemical texts are quite explicit about what must happen to this false king. He must be dissolved, putrefied, blackened, killed. The Rosarium Philosophorum depicts this process in a series of woodcuts showing the king and queen, representing the solar and lunar principles, descending together into the bath of dissolution, where their bodies decompose and merge in the dark waters of the unconscious. This is not a metaphor for gentle personal growth or comfortable self-acceptance. It is a phenomenological description of the psychological experience of ego death, of the dissolution of the organizing principles that have structured your identity and your relationship to reality. In practical terms, this means the collapse of the rigid belief systems, the defended positions, the carefully maintained self-image that your inner tyrant has constructed and enforced. It means allowing yourself to fall into confusion, uncertainty, not knowing. It means the terrible recognition that the emperor has no clothes, that the authority you have obeyed was never legitimate, that the safety you purchased through submission to tyrannical control was always an illusion. This process unfolds in stages, each with its own phenomenological signature and each requiring specific psychological operations. The initial stage, what the texts call the confrontatio or confrontation, begins when you first recognize the tyrant as tyrant rather than as legitimate authority. This recognition typically arrives unbidden, triggered by life circumstances that expose the fundamental inadequacy of the tyrannical approach to living. Perhaps the perfect standards you have maintained reveal themselves as defenses against authentic intimacy. Perhaps the control you have exercised over your environment fails catastrophically, demonstrating that you were never as sovereign as you believed. Perhaps you glimpse in a moment of unwelcome clarity that the voice you have been obeying, the voice you thought was protecting you, is actually the source of your imprisonment. In the political sphere, this moment arrives when enough citizens simultaneously recognize that the emperor is naked, that the strong man is weak, that the entire apparatus of domination rests on nothing more substantial than collective agreement to pretend otherwise. In Venezuela, this recognition spread like fire through dry grass, once the regime could no longer maintain the fiction of electoral legitimacy. In your interior kingdom, it arrives when the cost of obedience finally exceeds your capacity to pay it. The second stage, the separatio or separation, requires that you distinguish between authentic order and tyrannical control, between appropriate structure and rigidity born of fear. This is subtle work, requiring unusual discrimination. The tyrant archetype is dangerous precisely because it mimics legitimate authority, because it often begins as a genuine response to chaos and only gradually hardens into something pathological. Your inner tyrant may have once served a protective function, establishing boundaries and standards in response to a genuinely threatening environment. The work of separatio involves acknowledging this history while recognizing that what once protected now imprisons, that the solution has become the problem. In alchemical terms, this is the separation of the pure from the impure, the extraction of the philosophical mercury from the common quicksilver. You are seeking to identify and preserve the authentic impulse toward order, toward excellence, toward self-discipline, what Jung termed healthy ego strength, while isolating and exposing the fear-driven compulsion for absolute control that has parasitized these legitimate functions. The third stage, the mortificatio or death, demands that you actually relinquish the tyrannical control, that you allow the rigid structures to collapse. This is not merely an intellectual recognition, but an embodied surrender, a descent into genuine not-knowing that cannot be simulated or bypassed through spiritual bypassing or premature forgiveness. The alchemical texts describe this phase as a descent into the nigredo, the blackening, a condition of maximum despair and confusion in which all previous certainties dissolve and nothing has yet emerged to replace them. The prima materia, or raw material of the work, reveals itself in this darkness, the chaotic, undifferentiated psychic energy that the tyrannical ego has been so desperately trying to control and organize. This material is indeed dangerous, indeed potentially overwhelming, and the tyrant was not entirely wrong to fear it. But the error lay in believing that it could be controlled through domination rather than related to through conscious suffering and patient endurance. What sustains an individual through this phase of the work? The texts speak of the vas hermeticum, the hermetic vessel or sealed container in which the transformation occurs. Psychologically, this vessel is composed of whatever commitments, practices, relationships and frameworks provide enough structure to prevent psychotic dissolution while allowing the necessary degree of chaos for genuine transformation. It might be a therapeutic relationship that holds you through the collapse of your defended positions. It might be a spiritual practice that provides continuity of attention even as the contents of consciousness radically shift. It might be participation in a community that has witnessed such transformations before and can assure you that this death is not the end. Without such a vessel, the confrontation with the tyrant can indeed lead to overwhelming inflation or devastating collapse. With it, the death becomes the prelude to rebirth rather than simple annihilation. The fourth stage, the purificatio or purification, begins as you start to discriminate between the various voices and impulses that emerge from the chaos of the Nigredo. Having dissolved the tyrannical structure, you find yourself flooded with previously suppressed material. Desires you had forbidden yourself, anger you had learned to convert into depression, spontaneity you had crushed beneath impossible standards. The alchemical texts describe this as the washing of the blackened matter, the separation of the subtle from the gross. In psychological terms, you are learning to distinguish between the tyrant archetype itself, which must remain permanently dethroned, and the legitimate functions it had usurped. This requires what Jung termed active imagination, a sustained dialogue with the various sub-personalities and complexes that constitute your psyche, treating them not as problems to be solved, but as voices to be heard and needs to be acknowledged. The fifth stage, the conjunctio or union, represents the integration of opposites that had been held apart by the tyrant's refusal to allow anything that challenged his absolute rule. In alchemical imagery, this is the sacred marriage of king and queen, sun and moon, sulfur and mercury, the union that produces the philosopher's stone. Psychologically, it is the establishment of what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposing principles without collapsing into identification with either. Where the tyrant insisted on purity, on the elimination of all that contradicted his preferred narrative, the integrated consciousness recognizes that wholeness requires the inclusion of contradiction, that the self emerges not from the victory of one principle over another, but from their mutual embrace. This means learning to be both structured and spontaneous, both disciplined and flexible, both self-directed and open to influence. It means developing a relationship to authority, including your own inner authority, that is neither submission to tyranny nor adolescent rebellion against all constraint. But here we must pause to acknowledge something that the political analogy both reveals and conceals. When Maduro falls, if he falls, when he is finally forced from power, Venezuela does not automatically become a functioning democracy. The removal of the tyrant creates an opportunity for something better, but guarantees nothing. The same citizens who lived under his rule must now develop the capacity for self-governance, must learn to internalize the democratic principles they had perhaps only experienced as external constraint or propaganda. They must resist the temptation to simply install a different strongman, must tolerate the anxiety and conflict that genuine democracy requires. The psychological parallel is exact. Deposing your inner tyrant does not automatically produce integration. It creates the space in which integration might occur, but that space must be actively inhabited, cultivated, developed through sustained practice and continual choice. The temptation after defeating the tyrant is either to install a new tyranny, perhaps one wearing more acceptable clothing, speaking the language of spirituality or self-help rather than overt domination, or to collapse into the opposite extreme, rejecting all structure and discipline as inherently oppressive. The alchemical tradition warns against both errors through the imagery of the fire that must be carefully regulated throughout the great work. Too little heat and the process stalls, the matter remaining unreformed. Too much heat and the vessel shatters, the material burns to ash. The fire represents focused attention, sustained effort, disciplined practice, all the functions that the tyrant archetype had monopolized and distorted. After his deposition, these functions must be reclaimed and re-established in service of integration rather than control. In relationship to the self, rather than the inflated ego, this is perhaps the most difficult and most easily misunderstood aspect of the work. The goal is not the elimination of order, structure, or discipline. The goal is not to live without standards or to validate every impulse as equally valuable. The alchemists sought to produce gold, not to remain forever in the chaos of prima materia. Jung emphasized that individuation produces stronger ego functioning, not ego dissolution. The integrated individual possesses greater capacity for sustained effort, clearer discernment, more refined judgment than the person still identified with either the tyrant or his unconscious opposite. But this order emerges from below rather than being imposed from above, grows organically from sustained relationship with the self rather than being manufactured by willpower, reflects genuine values rather than compensating for hidden shame or fear. Consider what happens in the aftermath of political tyranny, when the work of integration actually succeeds rather than simply replacing one form of domination with another. There emerges a new form of citizenship characterized not by obedience to external authority or by adolescent rebellion against all constraint, but by the internalization of democratic principles, by the capacity to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility, by the tolerance for disagreement and uncertainty that genuine self-governance requires. The former subjects of tyranny must learn to think for themselves, while also collaborating with others, must develop their own judgment while remaining open to persuasion, must claim their agency while acknowledging their interdependence. This is difficult, uncomfortable work that offers none of the false certainties of authoritarian rule. It requires the capacity to tolerate ambiguity, to hold tension, to accept that good governance, like good living, is a practice rather than a destination. The psychological parallel unfolds along identical lines. After deposing your inner tyrant, you must learn to govern yourself through what might be termed democratic rather than authoritarian principles. This means developing the capacity to hear and consider the various voices within your psyche, the desires, the fears, the values, the impulses, without allowing any single voice to dominate all the others. It means establishing internal processes for deliberation and decision-making that honor both your rational faculties and your emotional wisdom, both your personal needs and your ethical commitments. It means accepting that you will sometimes make mistakes, sometimes experience conflict between equally valid priorities, sometimes have to revise your positions based on new information or changing circumstances. This ongoing negotiation, this perpetual balancing act, lacks the rigid stability of tyrannical control, but it possesses something the tyrant can never provide: the flexibility to adapt, to grow, to become more fully yourself, rather than remaining frozen in a defensive posture that was perhaps once necessary, but has long since ossified into a prison. What emerges from the successful completion of this alchemical operation, from the death of the tyrant and the establishment of conscious self-governance, is what the texts call the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, the substance that can transform base metal into gold. In psychological terms, this is the integrated self, the personality that has incorporated both light and shadow, that can act from wholeness rather than compensation, that possesses what Jung termed psychological sovereignty. This sovereignty differs fundamentally from the tyrant's domination. The tyrant rules through fear and maintains power by keeping his subjects, whether external citizens or internal psychological functions, weak, divided, and dependent. The sovereign self coordinates through love and grows stronger as the various aspects of the psyche develop their own strength and capability. The tyrant demands obedience. The self invites participation. The tyrant sees difference as threat. The self recognizes diversity as resource. The tyrant must continuously prove his power. The self simply is. But we must not romanticize this outcome or present it as a permanent achievement that, once attained, requires no further effort. The alchemical texts emphasize that the stone itself must be continually renewed through repetition of the work at higher levels of refinement. Jung observed that individuation is a lifelong process, not a destination reached and then permanently occupied. The tyrant archetype, once dethroned, does not simply disappear, but rather remains present as a potential that must be continually recognized and refused. In moments of stress, uncertainty, or fear, the old patterns reassert themselves. The voice that promises safety through absolute control whispers again its seductive lies. The temptation to reimpose rigid order when faced with chaos never entirely vanishes. The work of maintaining conscious self-governance requires ongoing attention, continual choice, repeated commitment to the more difficult path of integration over the false comfort of domination. This is why the alchemical texts speak of the opus as circular, the Ouroboros, the serpent consuming its own tail, representing the eternal return to the beginning of the work at a new level of consciousness. Each time you recognize the tyrant's voice and choose not to obey it, each time you tolerate the discomfort of uncertainty rather than grasping for false certainty, each time you hold the tension between opposing truths rather than collapsing into simplistic either-or thinking, you strengthen the vessel of consciousness that can contain increasingly complex operations. The first iteration of the work might involve simply recognizing the tyrant as distinct from yourself. The second might require understanding his historical necessity and forgiving his presence. The third might demand that you integrate the legitimate functions he had usurped while continuing to refuse his domination. The fourth might call you to develop such refined discrimination that you can employ the tyrant's energy, his capacity for focus, for discipline, for sustained effort, while never allowing him to resume control. The political theater continues to unfold as you read these words. Maduro may yet retain power through raw force, demonstrating that tyranny can persist long after it has lost all legitimacy. Or he may fall, creating space for whatever form of governance Venezuela can construct from the rubble of his regime. But regardless of what happens in Caracas, the question remains. What happens in the interior country where you actually live? The tyrant who rules there cares nothing for Venezuelan politics, recognizes no authority beyond his own appetite for control, and will continue his reign until you develop both the awareness to recognize him and the courage to dethrone him. This is not metaphor. This is the most literal and consequential political fact of your existence. The quality of your life, the depth of your relationships, the authenticity of your choices, the possibility of your continued growth, all depend on whether you live under tyranny or in conscious self-governance. The work begins with recognition, not the comfortable recognition of tyrants in others, not the satisfying condemnation of political strongmen safely distant from your daily life, but the uncomfortable recognition of the tyrant in your own psyche. He appears as the voice that permits no rest, demands perfection, recognizes no achievement as sufficient. He manifests as the rigidity that cannot adapt when circumstances change, the defensiveness that cannot admit error, the brittleness that shatters under stress. He reveals himself in your contempt for your own weakness, your cruelty toward your own mistakes, your refusal to allow yourself the ordinary human privileges of confusion, uncertainty, and gradual learning. He is there in the impossible standards that guarantee perpetual failure and thus justify his continued harsh rule. He is there in the systematic suppression of spontaneity, play, joy, and any other impulse that might threaten his grim regime of productivity and achievement. The question is not whether you will encounter this figure. He dwells in every psyche, an archetypal potential that human consciousness seems to invariably constellate. The question is whether you will recognize him when he appears wearing the mask of your best self, claiming to represent your highest values, insisting that his rigid control is the only thing preventing your complete collapse into chaos and mediocrity. The question is whether you will believe his propaganda or whether you will develop the capacity to see through it, to recognize that genuine order does not require tyranny, that authentic achievement does not demand the sacrifice of your humanity, that real strength lies not in rigid control, but in flexible responsiveness to what each moment actually requires. In the sealed vessel of your own consciousness, where the great work proceeds, whether you attend to it or not, the tyrant stands waiting. The fire beneath the crucible burns, whether you tend it consciously or allow it to rage out of control. The prima materia churns and ferments, seeking its transformation into philosophical gold or degrading into toxic sludge, depending on the quality of attention you bring to the process. The choice before you is not whether to engage this work, life will force the engagement regardless, but whether to engage it consciously, with understanding of the principles involved, with respect for the dangers inherent in the operation, with commitment to seeing it through to completion rather than abandoning it when the darkness descends. The strong man falls in the plaza, captured on smartphone cameras and broadcast to a world that has witnessed this scene countless times before and will doubtless witness it countless times again. The crowd celebrates, tears down his statues, defaces his portraits, believes perhaps that his removal solves the problem his presence revealed. But the deeper problem remains, written in the psychological source code of human consciousness itself, the tendency to seek safety and domination, to mistake control for sovereignty, to build elaborate prisons and call them kingdoms. Until each individual confronts this tendency in their own psyche, recognizes the tyrant who rules there, and undertakes the difficult, dangerous, absolutely necessary work of his deposition and the even more difficult work of establishing genuine self-governance in his place, the same drama will continue to unfold in both the interior and exterior theaters of human life. The alchemists buried their most precious secrets in obscure symbolism, hid their genuine operations behind descriptions of seemingly impossible chemical processes, spoke in riddles and contradictions to protect the work from those unprepared to undertake it responsibly. But the secret they protected was never about making literal gold from literal lead. It was about the transformation of consciousness from unconscious identification with the tyrant archetype to conscious relationship with the self, from domination to integration, from the brittle rigidity of absolute control to the flexible strength of genuine wholeness. This transformation remains as necessary today as it was in their medieval laboratories, perhaps more necessary as our technologies of external control become ever more sophisticated, while our capacity for internal governance atrophies from disuse. The treasure you seek is not hidden in distant news broadcasts of falling dictators or in comfortable condemnations of political tyranny safely removed from your daily life. It is buried in the most familiar and thus most invisible territory of your own psyche, guarded by the very voice you have trusted most completely. The voice that has promised to keep you safe through its ruthless control, but has delivered instead a prison you have learned to mistake for home. The work of excavating this treasure, of deposing this interior tyrant, of establishing conscious governance in the kingdom of your own soul, this is the great work to which the alchemists devoted their lives and which remains in its essentials. Exactly the same work that confronts you now. The only question is whether you will begin it, whether you will tend the fire carefully through the long nights of dissolution, whether you will hold faith through the darkness that genuine transformation requires. The gold is not in the external world's political theaters. The gold is in the interior laboratory where consciousness transforms itself through the marriage of awareness and courage, through the death of what you thought you were and the birth of what you might become.